The sun had already dropped below the tree line when the parents realized something was wrong. At first, it was just nervous glances at watches, idle chatter to mask the unease. A few minutes late wasn't unusual. But as the shadows grew long across the quiet rural road, unease gave way to dread. One by one, the parents waiting at the country bus stop began pulling out their phones, calling neighbors, pacing, their voices rising with worry. Where was the yellow bus? It should have been there. 7 children, all second graders, had climbed on that afternoon with laughter still clinging to their voices, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, waving to their mothers from the windows. The ride from school was routine, barely 10 minutes. But tonight, as darkness pressed in, the bus never arrived. By the time half an hour had passed, fear spread like wildfire. Truck engines roared to life as fathers sped off down country lanes. Mothers called the school, their voices breaking. Police were notified, deputies scrambled. And when the first patrol car reached the empty stretch of road between the school and the neighborhood, the terrible truth began to sink in. The bus wasn't late. The bus was gone. Caleb Morris was 24 then, a rookie officer still learning how to steady his hands when adrenaline surged. He was one of the first called to the scene. He remembered the look on the parents' faces that night more clearly than any crime scene photo. The wide eyes, the trembling hands clutching photographs, the desperation that turned every mother and father into detectives themselves. "Find them!" a woman screamed at him, her face streaked with tears. "You have to find them." He promised he would. And even as the hours ticked past, even as helicopters swept their spotlights across the endless dark fields, even as search dogs barked and men combed ditches with flashlights, Caleb clung to the belief that the bus would turn up. Maybe a breakdown. Maybe the driver had taken a detour. There had to be a logical explanation. But dawn came, and still, there was nothing. The investigation moved fast that first week. State police and FBI agents poured into town, canvassing every mile of backroad. Volunteers searched the woods shoulder to shoulder, calling out the children's names until their throats bled raw. Reporters swarmed in, cameras flashing, headlines screaming about the vanished school bus. Yet not a single trace was found. No skid marks. No debris. No radio calls from the driver. The only sign, faint and inconclusive, were tire tracks on a dirt road leading into the pines, but they disappeared less than a mile in. Search teams combed every inch, but the bus might as well have dissolved into thin air. For the families, hope began to crumble. For Caleb, guilt took root. He replayed every moment of that first night, every choice he made, every word he spoke to those parents. He had told them their children would come home. And they never did. 10 years later, the town still carried the wound like a scar that refused to fade. At the bus stop where the children should have climbed down smiling, there stood a small memorial. Stuffed animals long bleached by rain and sun, photographs in cracked frames, flowers placed fresh each anniversary. People still drove slower when they passed, heads bowed. The mothers gathered there every September, candles in hand, whispering the names of the 7 who never returned. Some had moved away, unable to live in a town haunted by absence. Others stayed, bound by the invisible tether of unanswered questions. And Caleb? He was no longer the fresh-faced rookie. Now in his 40s, his hair flecked with gray, he carried himself like a man who had aged twice as fast as his years. He still wore the badge, still patrolled the same quiet roads. But every time he passed the bus stop, his chest tightened. At his side trotted Diesel, a large German shepherd with sharp eyes and a nose that missed nothing. Diesel was his partner now, his anchor. The dog had no memory of that night, no guilt tied to broken promises. But Caleb did. And sometimes, late at night, he caught himself whispering to the empty air, as though speaking to those children, "I should have done more." The case had long since gone cold. Files sat stacked in dusty cabinets. Theories had come and gone, a hidden accident, a kidnapping, even wild rumors of human trafficking. None had been proven. The driver's family insisted he was a good man, incapable of harm. But the questions never stopped gnawing. Did he choose another road? Was he forced? Was he part of something unthinkable? People moved on with their lives, but not completely. Every new parent who put a child on a school bus in that county felt a shiver of fear. Every late arrival stirred panic. For Caleb, it wasn't just professional failure. It was personal shame. He had promised those parents their children would be found, and he had failed them. That September evening, 10 years later, Caleb parked near the old bus stop. The sun had set the same way it had that night, dipping behind the trees, leaving long shadows across the quiet road. He stood by the memorial, watching candles flicker in the wind. Mothers stood together, their voices low, their eyes tired but still searching. Diesel pressed against his leg, ears pricked. The dog's low growl broke the silence, a sound so sudden Caleb's breath caught. He turned toward the woods beyond the road, where the pines stood dark and endless. For a moment, he thought he saw a glint of metal deep between the trees, something dull and forgotten beneath the vines. He blinked, and it was gone. But Diesel kept staring, tail stiff, nose twitching. And Caleb felt a chill crawl down his spine. Maybe the bus hadn't disappeared. Maybe it had just been waiting. For most towns in America, 10 years can pass in a blur. Children grow up, storefronts change, seasons roll on. But for the small community where the bus vanished, time stood still. Every year, the calendar circled back to the same week in September, and the air grew heavy with memories. The town wasn't just marked by what had happened, it was defined by it. At the old bus stop, there stood a shrine that never faded. Teddy bears with their colors washed away by rain, laminated photographs cracked from the sun, and hand-painted signs pleading for answers. Some of the items had been there since the very first week after the disappearance. Others were placed more recently, tokens left by strangers who had read about the mystery online or in true crime forums. It had become a place of pilgrimage for people who felt the chill of unsolved tragedy. For the mothers, though, it wasn't just a memorial. It was a tether to the children they lost, the only ground where they could still feel close to them. On the 10th anniversary, they gathered again, candles glowing in the twilight. Some women leaned on each other for balance, others clutched photos to their chests. They spoke the names softly, as if afraid the wind might carry them away. Caleb Morris stood at the edge of the crowd, his uniform a reminder that the case remained stamped with the weight of official failure. He kept Diesel at his side, the dog's ears twitching as the murmurs carried across the field. Caleb wasn't here to make speeches or offer false comfort. He had done that once, and it had haunted him for a decade. He remembered the faces from that night as if burned into his mind. Mothers collapsing onto the ground when dawn came and there was no bus. Fathers pounding the hoods of their trucks in frustration. A grandmother clutching rosary beads so tightly that the metal cross cut into her palm. He had promised them answers, but instead he had delivered silence. Now, at 44, Caleb looked older than his years. His hair carried streaks of gray, his face lined not just from the sun but from guilt. Diesel leaned into him, steadying him when the ache of memory grew too sharp. The town itself bore scars that were harder to see but just as real. The elementary school had struggled for years, enrollment dropping as families moved away, unwilling to send their children into a community haunted by unanswered questions. Businesses on Main Street never recovered from the exodus. Outsiders referred to it as that bus town, as if the mystery were the only thing it would ever be known for. Some residents clung to hope long past reason. A few mothers insisted their children might still be alive somewhere, perhaps taken but not gone forever. They searched online for look-alike photographs of teenagers, sending tips to the FBI that never went anywhere. Others carried their grief like a stone, refusing to speak of it at all. Rumors became the only fuel left for imagination. Some believed the bus had slid into a hidden ravine no one had found. Others whispered of a trafficking ring, a possibility that left parents sick to their stomachs. And a darker theory circulated in hushed tones, that someone within the community itself had orchestrated it. After all, the bus didn't drive itself. Caleb never liked that last theory, not because it was impossible, but because it was too close to home. He had lived his whole life in this county. He knew the driver, Harold Jenkins, a man in his 50s who'd worked for the school district for decades. Harold had been a quiet, steady presence. He attended church, coached Little League, and waved to neighbors. The idea that Harold had betrayed the children in his care gnawed at Caleb's conscience. Yet Harold never came home that night either. His family insisted he would never hurt those children. Still, the fact remained, Harold had vanished with them, and no one ever proved what role he played. That evening, as the candlelight vigil dwindled, Caleb noticed how empty the streets felt once everyone left. It wasn't just physical emptiness, it was the silence of a place that had given up on answers. The sheriff's department had long since closed the case as cold. Files sat in a basement cabinet, untouched except for the occasional review when some new lead popped up, which always turned out to be nothing. But for Caleb, the case wasn't cold. It lived under his skin. Every night shift he drove past the old bus stop, his headlights sweeping across the faded toys, the photographs staring back at him. Every time, he told himself the same thing: there's still something we missed. Diesel stirred beside him, pulling him out of thought. The dog's sharp eyes fixed on the tree-line again, the same way he had earlier that night. Caleb frowned, following the dog's gaze. There was nothing but pines, black and endless. Still, the memory of that faint glint, that metallic flash deep in the woods, nagged at him. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered, though his own voice shook. He knew the odds. 10 years was a lifetime. If the bus had been hidden somewhere all this time, it would have been found. And yet, a small voice inside him refused to quiet. What if it hadn't been an accident? What if the bus had been deliberately hidden, buried in the woods where no one would think to look? Diesel whined softly, his nose twitching. Caleb clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the possibility that the dog was sensing nothing, or that the dog was sensing exactly what he feared. As the last candle flickered out at the memorial, Caleb slid behind the wheel of his cruiser. Diesel climbed into the passenger seat, still alert, still staring into the dark forest. Caleb turned the key, the engine rumbling. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he parked a mile up the road and sat in silence, eyes fixed on the tree line. He thought about the mothers, about their hands trembling as they lit their candles. He thought about the children's faces, forever frozen in those second-grade portraits. And he thought about the glint of metal. 10 years of silence, and yet tonight, for the first time in a decade, Caleb felt the whisper of possibility. The bus wasn't gone. It was waiting to be found. The phone call came early on a Tuesday morning. Caleb was pouring his second cup of coffee, Diesel curled at his feet, when the dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. "Unit 12, we've got a report from a logging crew off County Road 17. They say they've found, well, they think it's a vehicle." Caleb's hand froze midair. A vehicle in the woods wasn't unusual. Plenty of old trucks rusted out where teenagers had abandoned them decades ago. But the dispatcher's hesitation set his nerves buzzing. "What kind of vehicle?" he asked. There was a pause. Then, "They're saying a bus." Caleb's mug hit the counter so hard it sloshed coffee onto the tile. Diesel's head shot up, ears pricked. By the time he reached the site, the air smelled of pine sap and fresh-cut wood. Chainsaws had fallen silent, the loggers standing in a loose circle near the tree-line, their hard hats clutched like offerings. One of them, a big man with a beard dusted in sawdust, stepped forward when Caleb arrived. "We were clearing back about 100 yards, the man said, voice low, "and we saw something metal sticking out of the brush. Thought it was an old trailer at first. But then," he swallowed, "it's yellow." Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need to. His chest had already tightened with the weight of realization. The walk through the underbrush felt endless. Diesel trotted ahead, tail stiff, his nose working furiously. The forest floor was damp with last night's rain, and vines hung like ropes from the trees. Then Caleb saw it. Half buried under moss and kudzu, its roof caved in by years of branches, sat the unmistakable shape of a school bus. The paint had faded to a sickly pale, but streaks of yellow still bled through. Windows were shattered, their edges jagged with rust. The front grille leaned like a mouth frozen mid-scream. For 10 years, the forest had kept it secret. Caleb's throat went dry. He heard one of the loggers mutter, "Lord have mercy," as they all stood in reverent silence. He radioed for backup, his voice rougher than he intended. Within the hour, deputies arrived, crime scene tape strung between trees like a ghostly fence. A state investigator came too, shaking his head in disbelief. 10 years, the man said quietly. And it was here the whole time. Caleb crouched near the bus, his flashlight cutting across the corroded surface. Diesel paced back and forth, growling low, hackles raised. The dog had worked dozens of crime scenes, but Caleb had never seen him so unsettled. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, though his own pulse was hammering. The doors were fused shut by rust. Deputies brought in tools, the screech of metal against metal echoing through the forest. Every twist of the crowbar felt like prying open a coffin. Caleb's hands trembled as he helped brace the frame. Finally, with a groan that sent birds scattering from the treetops, the door gave way. The smell hit first: mold, decay, the sour bite of water damage. But underneath it all was something else, something older and heavier, like a breath that had been trapped for years. Flashlights pierced the gloom inside. The interior was frozen in time. Torn seats slumped against each other, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. Small backpacks lay scattered on the floor, the zippers rusted shut. Faded stickers clung to the windows, superheroes, rainbows, names scrawled in childish handwriting. It should have been the scene of a disaster. Yet there were no bones, no bodies, no blood, only absence. Caleb stepped inside, his boots crunching on broken glass. The silence pressed against him, thicker than the darkness. He imagined the sound of children's voices echoing off these walls, and his stomach twisted. On the dashboard, still coated in dust, sat a leather wallet. He opened it with gloved hands. Inside was an ID card. Harold Jenkins, the driver. His cash remained untouched. It made no sense. Diesel whined from the back of the bus. Caleb turned, watching as the dog scratched furiously at the floorboards beneath the last row of seats. His growls reverberated off the metal walls. "Hold up," Caleb said, kneeling beside him. The wood was warped and splintered, as though something heavy had pressed down from beneath. Caleb's flashlight caught a faint scratch across the paneling, not from claws, but from something sharper, deliberate. He ran his hand across it and froze. Initials, carved into the wood. They were faint, almost erased by time, but still legible: LM. Caleb's chest tightened. He remembered one of the girls, Lily Mae Carter. She would have been 17 now. His throat burned as he whispered, "She was here." The investigators called for specialized teams, but Caleb barely heard them. His ears rang with the sound of his own heartbeat. He stepped back outside, gulping fresh air, staring at the vines that had swallowed the bus whole. For a decade, parents had lit candles, prayed for miracles, begged for answers. And the bus, their children's last known refuge, had been sitting here in the woods the entire time. Caleb leaned against a tree, his legs unsteady. Diesel pressed against him, eyes fixed on the tree-lean, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Caleb knew this was no accident. The bus had not simply crashed and been forgotten. It had been hidden. And whoever had hidden it might still be out there. That night, as the forest cleared of deputies and floodlights, Caleb lingered behind. He stared at the rusted frame of the bus, illuminated by the moon. He thought of the initials, the wallet, the toys. Evidence of life, and yet not a single answer. Diesel whined softly, nuzzling his hand. Caleb stroked the dog's head, his jaw set. For 10 years, the town had lived in silence. But now the silence had been broken. And Caleb understood one thing with terrifying clarity. This was just the beginning. The crime scene lights cast long, ghostly shadows across the forest floor. The bus loomed in the middle of the clearing like some relic dragged out of a nightmare. Deputies stood in clusters, their voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever secrets still clung to the rusted shell. Caleb stepped back inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the gutted interior. The air was damp and stale, heavy with mildew, and every breath scraped his throat. Diesel padded behind him, claws clicking against the warped metal floor. The dog's movements were tense, deliberate, his nose twitching as he sniffed the shadows. It looked like time had stopped the moment the bus disappeared. Cracked crayons lay scattered on the floor, their colors dulled by grime. Stickers of stars and smiley faces peeled from the seat backs. One seat even held a lunchbox, pink plastic with faded unicorns, still snapped shut. Caleb crouched, pried it open with gloved hands, and found a sandwich reduced to dust and mold. His stomach turned. The absence of bodies was what unsettled everyone most. Deputies whispered about it outside the tape. If the bus had been left here for 10 years, why wasn't there even a trace of the driver or the children? No bones, no clothing fibers, no sign of a struggle. Just belongings left behind, as if the children had stepped off quietly and vanished into thin air. On the dashboard, Harold Jenkins's wallet still sat where Caleb had found it. The driver's ID card peered out from the cracked leather sleeve, his picture faded but recognizable. Harold's family had always insisted he was innocent, but the fact that his belongings were here, and he was not, raised more questions than answers. Diesel whined softly and scratched at the floor again, nose pressed to the last row. Caleb followed, his flashlight grazing over the initials carved into the panel, LM. His throat tightened at the memory of Lily Mae Carter's photograph. Freckles, wide grin, missing front tooth. That was no coincidence. He pressed his palm to the worn wood. Someone had been here. Someone small, scared, and desperate enough to carve their name into the floor. Investigators moved carefully, photographing every inch, bagging items for evidence. Caleb found himself staring at the drawings still taped to the windows. One was of a house with a tall oak tree beside it. Another showed stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. Normal, innocent images, except that now they felt like messages from ghosts. He remembered parents showing him those drawings in the first frantic days after the disappearance. They had begged him to look at every scrap of paper, every coloring page, as though some clue might be hidden there. He had assured them it didn't work like that. But standing here now, he wondered if maybe he had been wrong. Maybe the children had tried to leave signs, and no one had been listening. Diesel's growl broke the silence. The dog had moved to the rear emergency exit, pawing at the door. Caleb hurried over, shining his light along the seams. Rust had sealed it shut, but the dirt around the bottom was disturbed, looser than the rest of the floor. "Something's here," Caleb muttered. A deputy joined him, and together they pried at the panel. After several minutes of grunting effort, the warped metal shifted, revealing a narrow gap beneath. Caleb's flashlight probed the opening, and the beam caught on something thin and pale. He reached in carefully with gloved fingers and pulled out a scrap of paper. It was brittle, edges torn, but words were scrawled in childish handwriting. "We wait. She said she will come." The letters shook with uneven strokes, as though written in the dark. Caleb's hand trembled as he slid the note into an evidence bag. His chest felt hollow. The children hadn't died in the bus. They had been waiting for someone they trusted enough to follow. Outside, the investigators debated whether the bus had been deliberately moved here or hidden from the beginning. Caleb barely heard them. His mind churned with the note, with the initials carved in the floor, with the untouched driver's wallet. The puzzle pieces didn't fit, but the outline of something monstrous was taking shape. He stepped back outside for air. The forest felt thicker now, the pines pressing close, the night filled with the hum of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Diesel stuck close to his side, ears still swiveling toward the tree-line as if waiting for something unseen. "Whoever did this," Caleb whispered, mostly to himself, "they weren't strangers." He thought of the mothers, of how they had clung to one another at the bus stop, whispering names into the night. He thought of the rumors that had swirled for years, of men hanging near the school, of roads taken that shouldn't have been. And he thought of Harold Jenkins, the driver, whose belongings were here but whose fate was not. The lead investigator finally approached, his face grim. "We'll comb the area, Expand the search grid. If the kids walked away from here, there should be traces. Footprints, remains, something. But Caleb wasn't convinced they had walked away at all. Not freely. Not without someone guiding them. He looked back at the bus, its windows dark, vines crawling over the roof like veins. For 10 years, the town had lived with silence. Now the silence had spoken, but only in fragments. Diesel pressed his muzzle into Caleb's hand, grounding him. The dog's eyes were steady, but his body remained taut, alert. He hadn't relaxed once since they found the bus. That alone told Caleb more than any report could. Something about this place was wrong. And it wasn't finished speaking yet. That night, long after the other deputies had packed up, Caleb stayed behind. He sat on the hood of his cruiser, watching the moonlight glint off the rusted roof. He thought of Lily May's initials, of the childish note, of the pink lunchbox still snapped shut. The children hadn't just disappeared. They had left behind whispers, carved wood, scribbled paper, artifacts of fear and hope. Caleb clenched his jaw. He had failed once, 10 years ago. He wouldn't fail again. Whatever had taken those children from the bus into the darkness of the woods, he was going to find it. The discovery of the bus rattled the town like an earthquake. News spread faster than wildfire. The yellow bus that had vanished 10 years ago had been found in the woods, swallowed by vines and silence. Television crews rolled in from Nashville and Atlanta, their bright lights cutting across the small-town streets. Reporters hounded neighbors for interviews, microphones shoved at anyone willing to talk. For a few days, the town was back under the harsh glare of the world's curiosity. But for the mothers, it wasn't about headlines. It was about wounds ripped open again, as raw as they had been a decade ago. Caleb knew he had to face them. He owed them more than just updates. He owed them his presence. He started with Linda Carter, Lily May's mother. She still lived in the same small ranch house on the edge of town, its porch light permanently burned out, curtains drawn tight. When Caleb knocked, she opened the door slowly, her face older than her years, her hair streaked gray. But her eyes, those hadn't dulled. "You found it," she whispered. No greeting, no pretense. Just the truth that had consumed her for 10 years. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said softly. "We did. But we didn't find them." Her hands trembled as she motioned him inside. The living room was a museum of Lily May's childhood. School portraits lined the mantel. Her backpack hung on a chair. A half-finished quilt, made from her daughter's old clothes, lay draped across the couch. Caleb sat quietly, letting Linda fill the silence. "She told me once," Linda said after a long pause, "that sometimes the driver didn't take the main road. Said he liked the back route. Said it was quicker." Caleb's jaw clenched. "She told you that before she disappeared?" 2 weeks before," Linda said. Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't think much of it. He was a trusted man. Everyone liked Harold. I thought maybe he was avoiding construction or something. But what if—" she broke off, her voice cracking. Caleb didn't finish her sentence for her. He couldn't. From Linda's house, Caleb moved on to the Johnsons, whose son Tyler had been one of the missing. Tyler's father barely spoke, just sat on the porch, staring into the distance with hollow eyes. But Mrs. Johnson met Caleb with a fire that hadn't dimmed. "Back then," she said, "I told the police I saw men hanging around the school. Strangers. They said it was nothing, that I was paranoid." Her voice hardened. "Don't tell me now that I imagined it. Because I didn't." Caleb nodded, his notebook open, Diesel lying at his feet. "Do you remember what they looked like?" "Tall. One had a scar across his cheek. They watched the buses. Watched the kids. I told Harold, too. He said he'd keep an eye out." The detail sent a chill down Caleb's spine. A scarred man. Watching children. And Harold, the driver, had known. Later that evening, Caleb spread his notes across his kitchen table. Diesel lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes following Caleb as he pieced things together. The stories overlapped. Harold sometimes took different roads. Strangers lingered by the school. The children themselves had noticed. And then there was the note inside the bus. "We wait. She said she will come." Who was she? A teacher? A mother? Someone the children trusted? The possibilities gnawed at him. Caleb couldn't shake the image of the mothers at the vigil, their faces glowing in candlelight. They had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. Each year they begged for answers, and each year the silence mocked them. Now, with the bus found, their questions grew sharper, more urgent. At the sheriff's office, Caleb sat through a meeting with state investigators. Charts were pinned to the walls, maps spread across the table. They talked logistics, soil analysis, search grids, DNA testing. But what stayed with Caleb was the undercurrent of unease. The evidence didn't point to strangers on the highway. It pointed inward, toward the community itself. "Someone had to know," one investigator muttered. "You don't hide a bus in the woods without help." That night, Caleb visited the bus site again. The tape still fluttered in the breeze, crime scene markers glowing under floodlights. He stepped inside the hollow shell once more, Diesel close behind. His flashlight caught on something he'd missed before, a child's shoe tucked under a seat. Small, white, with a faded cartoon character on the side. Caleb picked it up with gloved hands, holding it like it was made of glass. He closed his eyes and imagined a little girl kicking her feet as the bus rolled down the road, humming to herself, unaware her ride home was the last she'd ever take. The weight of it nearly crushed him. Diesel's bark jolted him. The dog pawed at the rear emergency exit again, nose pressed to the rust. Caleb knelt, running the light across the seams. This time, he noticed scratches not just from the inside, but outside too, as if someone had pried the door open once before. His stomach turned. The children hadn't simply been led away. Someone had taken them, one by one, through that very door. Caleb stood in the moonlight, his breath ragged. 10 years of silence had taught him one thing: evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. And in this town, someone knew exactly what happened. The woods were alive with sound, though most people wouldn't notice it. The creak of branches, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of something small darting through underbrush. But Caleb noticed everything. After 10 years of silence surrounding the missing bus, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. Diesel trotted ahead, nose close to the ground, tail stiff with focus. The dog had been restless ever since the bus was unearthed, tugging at the leash as though the answers were waiting just a few steps further into the pines. Caleb had learned long ago to trust Diesel's instincts. The dog never lied. "Show me, boy," Caleb murmured, letting the leash slacken as Diesel veered off the crime scene perimeter and into thicker woods. The deputies had already combed the area, marking evidence with yellow flags. But Diesel ignored their paths and carved his own, weaving between tree trunks, pulling Caleb deeper into the shadows. The ground was damp, the earth soft under Caleb's boots. It smelled of wet pine and rot. After about 50 yards, Diesel stopped abruptly and began circling a spot on the ground. He pawed at the soil, sending up sprays of dark earth. Caleb crouched, shining his flashlight. The beam caught something metallic, the corner of a rusted tin can. Beside it lay a melted plastic wrapper, almost unrecognizable. A deputy who had followed them whistled low. "Looks like somebody camped out here." But Caleb knew better. The ground bore signs of multiple fire pits, long extinguished. Shards of glass bottles, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Children had been here. Caleb's throat tightened as he bent lower. He spotted something half buried in the dirt. Brushing it free, he lifted a tiny sneaker no bigger than his hand. The sole had cracked with age, the laces frayed, but the cartoon character on the side was still visible. He remembered it instantly, a pair Tyler Johnson's mother had described, bright white with red trim. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. He'd heard Tyler's mother talk about those shoes at every anniversary vigil. She'd kept the other one in a box at home. This was the match. Diesel barked sharply, jolting Caleb out of the fog of memory. The dog had moved again, nose pressed to the ground, tail wagging now with urgent energy. Caleb rose, following as Diesel zigzagged toward a shallow creek bed dried up from the summer heat. There, at the edge of the mud, were faint impressions. Not boots, not the shoes of an adult, but small footprints frozen in time, preserved where the mud had hardened years ago. "God!" Caleb whispered, crouching low. His fingers hovered just above the prints, careful not to smudge them. They were tiny, unmistakable. Children had crossed here. 10 years, the deputy muttered behind him. How the hell are those still visible? Caleb didn't answer. He didn't believe in miracles, but something about this place felt untouched, as if the forest itself had been keeping watch. Diesel barked again, drawing Caleb's attention to a mound of moss at the creek's edge. The dog clawed furiously, dirt flying, until the ground gave way with a hollow clang. Caleb's pulse jumped. He knelt beside Diesel and scraped away the soil with his gloves. The tip of a metal hatch emerged from beneath the earth, its surface corroded but unmistakable. A handle jutted out, crusted with rust and mud. Caleb froze. This wasn't an accident. Someone had built this. Someone had hidden it. The deputy stepped back, muttering a curse. "You think this is—" Caleb didn't let him finish. His mind was already racing. The bus had been left to rot, a distraction, a grave without bodies. But this was where the real story had unfolded. He pressed his palm against the cold metal. The hatch was sealed shut, and years of earth had hardened over it. But he could feel the outline, the purpose behind it. This wasn't just storage. It was a shelter. Diesel whined, pawing at the hatch, ears back. Caleb's gut churned. He didn't need the dog's instincts to tell him what he already knew. The children had been down there. By nightfall, investigators swarmed the site. Floodlights turned the clearing into a stage, generators humming. Shovels dug frantically, peeling back layers of soil until the hatch was fully exposed. Caleb stood to the side, Diesel pressed against his leg, watching as gloves scraped away the last of the moss. When they finally pulled the handle, the hatch groaned in protest, a scream of rust and age. A cloud of stale, fetid air whooshed upward, carrying the unmistakable stench of something that had been sealed too long. Caleb's flashlight cut into the darkness below. A ladder descended into a concrete bunker, its walls damp and stained. On the floor were rotting mattresses, children's chalk drawings smeared across the walls, suns, houses, stick figures with smiling faces. The sight knocked the wind out of him. He gripped the edge of the hatch, knuckles white. The children hadn't just disappeared. They had lived here. For how long, he didn't dare imagine. Diesel growled, hackles rising, as if sensing the ghosts of what had once filled the room. Caleb forced himself to step down onto the ladder, boots clanging against metal rungs. The air grew heavier with each step. On the floor, he bent to pick up a stuffed bear, its fur matted, one eye missing. He held it in his gloved hands, chest tight. This was no accident. This was captivity. And then his light caught something else. Words scrawled across the wall in a child's handwriting, faded but legible. "We wait for Mom." Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs. His mind reeled. The note in the bus. The initials carved in the floor. And now this. The children hadn't been waiting for rescue. They had been waiting for someone specific. Someone they trusted enough to follow into the dark. As Caleb climbed back out, his face pale under the floodlights, he felt the eyes of every deputy on him. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The truth was sinking in. This wasn't the work of a faceless stranger passing through. This was personal. Someone in their town, someone close, had stolen those children. And after 10 years, their secret was clawing its way back into the light. The bunker smelled of mold and rust, but beneath it was something harder to place, a stale scent of lives once lived in fear. Caleb's flashlight swept slowly across the concrete walls, his boots crunching against debris. Diesel stayed at the top of the hatch, whining softly, ears pulled back. The dog didn't want to go any farther, and Caleb couldn't blame him. The chalk drawings were everywhere. Rainbows, stick figures, suns with smiling faces, the kind of art every second grader might make. But in this space, underground and airless, they felt haunting. A childish attempt to make a prison feel like home. On one wall, larger than the rest, a row of names was written. 7 names. He read them slowly, each one a knife to the chest. Lily May, Tyler, Sophie, Aaron, Jacob, Mia, Daniel. The children had been here. Caleb's light landed on a corner where 3 mattresses lay in a row. Their fabric was torn, stained with years of damp. Beside them sat a small box of toys, plastic soldiers, a Barbie doll missing its head, a deck of cards warped by moisture. Caleb knelt and picked up a crayon, its wrapper peeling, the tip worn down. He closed his eyes and pictured it. Children huddled here, whispering in the dark, waiting for someone to tell them what would happen next. Waiting for Mom. He'd seen desperation in crime before, but this was different. This was organized. Someone had planned to keep them alive down here, at least for a while. Back on the surface, deputies photographed the hatch and marked evidence. One of them shook his head. This isn't some drifter. Somebody knew about this place. Somebody in town. Caleb didn't respond. He was still replaying the words on the wall. We wait for Mom. The handwriting was childish, but the intent cut deep. Who had they been waiting for? Later that night, Caleb sat in his cruiser at the edge of the woods. Diesel lay beside him, head in Caleb's lap, his body warm and steady. Caleb scribbled in his notebook, his handwriting jagged in the dim light. The pattern was becoming clearer. The bus hadn't been a grave. It had been a decoy, a starting point. The real story had unfolded underground. The children had been kept alive for at least some time. And someone had promised to come back for them. He thought of the mother's testimonies, Linda mentioning Harold's secret detours, Mrs. Johnson talking about strange men at the school. But he also thought of the children's trust. They wouldn't follow just anyone into the woods. It had to be someone they knew. Someone who felt safe. And then there was Harold Jenkins. His wallet left behind, his presence erased. Was he the villain, or was he another victim? The following morning, Caleb returned to the bunker with Diesel. The air was cooler, less oppressive with the floodlights gone, but the weight of the place hadn't lifted. Diesel descended the ladder this time, his nose pressed to the concrete floor, tail swishing in short, anxious bursts. He stopped at the farthest corner, where the wall met the ground. His claws scratched furiously, echoing through the hollow chamber. Caleb crouched, brushing away years of dust and debris. There, tucked between 2 loose blocks, was another scrap of paper. He pulled it free, his gloves brushing against brittle edges. The paper was lined, torn from a school notebook. Across it, in the uneven scrawl of a child's hand, were 3 words. She never came. Caleb's breath hitched. His throat tightened as he slid the note into a bag. The children had waited. Days, maybe weeks. They had believed someone was coming for them. And when that someone never returned, their hope must have crumbled. He leaned against the damp wall, his chest aching. The betrayal wasn't just criminal, it was personal. Whoever had taken them hadn't done it through force alone. They had manipulated trust, used love as a weapon. Diesel whimpered softly, pressing his muzzle into Caleb's hand. Caleb stroked the dog's fur absently, his mind reeling. Outside, the media frenzy had exploded. Headlines screamed across every major outlet, lost school bus found after 10 years. Children's bunker discovered in Tennessee woods. Reporters demanded answers, but the sheriff's office released none. Families were shielded from cameras, but grief etched itself fresh on their faces. At the vigil that night, Linda Carter clutched Caleb's arm, her eyes blazing. You said you'd bring her home. You said that 10 years ago. Caleb swallowed hard. I know. And I failed you. But I swear to you now, I won't stop until we know the truth. Her voice broke, but her grip didn't loosen. Somebody promised them, Caleb. Somebody they trusted. Find out who it was. Back at his kitchen table, Caleb spread out every scrap of evidence. Photos of the bus. Drawings from the bunker. The shoe, the note, the names on the wall. Diesel lay close by, eyes half shut, but his body twitching as though even in sleep he could sense the weight pressing on his partner. The pieces all pointed in one direction: betrayal. The children had been taken not by strangers, but by someone woven into the fabric of the town. A neighbor, a teacher, a caregiver. Someone who could smile in church on Sunday, then vanish with 7 children on Monday. Caleb stared at the words again. We wait for Mom. She never came. The implications were brutal. Had one of the mothers been involved? Or someone who had posed as a protector? The thought made his stomach turn. Diesel lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked, a growl rumbling low in his throat. Caleb followed the dog's gaze to the window. The night outside was still, the street empty, but the hairs on Caleb's arms rose. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there knew he was getting close. Someone who had lived with their secret for a decade and wasn't ready for it to be unearthed. Caleb leaned back, exhaling slowly, his resolve hardening. The children's voices might have been silenced, but their whispers lingered in the walls, in the notes, in the lives they left behind. And Caleb Morris, with Diesel at his side, was going to follow those whispers until they led him to the truth, no matter how close to home it cut. The town hadn't slept since the bunker was discovered. Rumors rippled through diners, church pews, and gas station counters. Everyone had an opinion, but underneath it all was a gnawing fear. The truth wasn't out there somewhere. It was here, rooted in their own backyards. Caleb felt it with every step he took through Main Street. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted reassurance that the monster wasn't one of their own. Caleb couldn't give them that. Not yet. Diesel padded close at his side, the dog's presence steadying him. At the sheriff's office, Caleb sifted through boxes of files that hadn't been touched in years. Old interviews, faded photographs, and handwritten notes. He kept circling back to one name: Harold Jenkins, the driver. On paper, Harold was the obvious suspect. He was last seen behind the wheel. His wallet had been found in the bus. And yet, something about it didn't fit. His reputation in town was clean. No debts, no criminal record, no sign of erratic behavior. People trusted him with their children for decades. But then Caleb noticed a detail he'd overlooked before: a letter tucked into the corner of the file. It was written by Harold's wife, weeks after the disappearance. In it, she begged the sheriff to consider another possibility. Harold had been tricked. He was too trusting, the letter read. If someone told him the children needed to be taken somewhere safe, he would have believed them. That thought festered in Caleb's mind as he drove back to the woods. The bunker still sat under guard, evidence teams working around the clock. Diesel tugged on the leash, his nose twitching. He led Caleb not to the hatch this time, but along a faint trail behind it. They followed the winding path until Caleb stopped short. Half buried in the dirt was a plastic name tag, cracked and faded. He picked it up, brushing away the soil. It read, Ms. Harper, substitute teacher. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He remembered her clearly now. Melissa Harper. She'd worked at the elementary school that year, filling in for a maternity leave. She wasn't from town, but she'd fit right in quickly. Young, friendly, the kind of teacher kids adored. She'd always stayed behind at the bus stop, waving until the bus turned out of sight. And then, when the bus vanished, she vanished too. Everyone assumed she'd left after her contract ended. No one had ever connected her absence to the case. Until now. Caleb's hands trembled as he held the name tag. Diesel barked once, sharp and urgent, as if confirming the discovery. She was the mom, Caleb whispered. The one they were waiting for. The realization twisted his stomach. Melissa Harper hadn't been a stranger to those kids. She'd been a trusted figure, someone who smiled at them every morning, who helped tie their shoes and praised their drawings. She hadn't needed to scare them into the woods. They would have followed her willingly. Caleb stared into the forest, bile rising in his throat. What kind of betrayal was worse than this, turning love into a trap? The rest of the week blurred into interrogations, evidence checks, and phone calls to federal agents. A background search revealed Melissa Harper wasn't even her real name. She had used aliases across several states, leaving behind a trail of jobs at schools and daycares, each ending abruptly. Her motive remained murky. Theories ranged from trafficking to psychological obsession. But for the parents, the why no longer mattered as much as the who. The mask had been ripped away. They finally knew who had led their children into the dark. On Sunday evening, the town gathered at the bus stop once more. The vigil looked different this time. The grief was still there, but it carried a new edge, the sharp burn of betrayal. Mothers held candles, fathers clutched photographs, but now their tears mixed with anger. Caleb stood among them, Diesel pressed against his leg. When Linda Carter caught his eye, she didn't need to speak. Her gaze said everything. You found her. You gave us truth, even if it broke us. He nodded, throat tight, unable to form words. Later, after the candles burned down to stubs, Caleb walked back to his cruiser. He paused one last time by the memorial. Teddy bears slumped in the grass, photographs weathered but unforgotten. He bent down and straightened Lily May's picture, brushing dirt from the frame. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have seen it sooner. But I promise you this, she won't hide again." Diesel whined softly, leaning his head against Caleb's hand. For the first time in a decade, Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not peace, that would never come. But resolve. The children's voices, carried on chalk lines and carved initials, had finally been heard. The town would heal slowly, scar tissue forming over years of hurt. But now they had a name, a face, and a truth to cling to. And Caleb Morris, with Diesel at his side, knew his promise still stood. He would carry the weight of this case for as long as it took. Thank you for following this story. Do you believe betrayal is more painful when it comes from a stranger, or from someone we trust?